There was, Miss Jane Marple often reflected, no occasion so charmingly deceptive as a village wedding. Behind the froth of lace and flowers, behind the delicate rustle of silk and the sparkle of champagne glasses, there often lurked the more serious undercurrents of family ambitions, thwarted romances, jealousies, and quiet resentments. Indeed, she sometimes thought, if one wished to take the true measure of human character, it was not in the drawing-room but at the altar rails that it revealed itself most clearly. And so it was that she found herself, on a warm June morning, among the pews of St. Mary's Church in the village of Much Farrington, a place not far from her own beloved St. Mary Mead. The air was sweet with the perfume of roses and elderflower drifting in from the churchyard, and the organist had been coaxed into a most triumphant rendering of the bride, Miss Eleanor Hargreaves, daughter of a respectative, somewhat pompous Earl, was to marry Charles Denham, a handsome young barrister of rising reputation. The Hargreaves family had moved to the district scarcely 2 years prior, yet they had contrived in that short time to become fixtures of the county scene. Colonel Hargreaves, retired from the army, possessed the air of a man accustomed to command. His wife, a handsome woman of a certain age, was known for her sharp tongue and equally sharp sense of propriety. Their only child, Eleanor, was much admired, pretty, fair-haired, and possessed of that modern frankness which endeared her to some and unsettled others. It was generally agreed that the match with Charles Denham was a good one. He came from solid stock, the Denhams of Ashbrook Hall, and though his profession took him often to London, his roots were firmly set in the shires. There was, to be sure, a whisper here or there that Eleanor had not always been so steady in her affections, but village tongues will wag, and it was usually dismissed as idle speculation. Miss Marple, seated beside her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, allowed her blue eyes to rest thoughtfully upon the gathering, she noted, with that unobtrusive interest which had so often stood her in good stead. The little gestures and glances that passed among the families assembled. Colonel Hargreaves, stiff in his military finery, cast frequent and irritable looks toward the rear pew where a dishevelled young man lounged with the air of a disaffected guest. Mrs. Hargreaves, meanwhile, surveyed the congregation with an expression of faint disdain, as though the company were not quite up to her standards. At the altar stood the bridegroom, tall and fair, his features schooled into composure yet betraying, to a keen observer, an underlying tension. Eleanor herself, radiant in ivory satin, walked up the aisle with a smile that flickered at times into something more uncertain. The ceremony began with all the proper solemnity, the vicar's voice intoning the familiar words, the congregation leaning forward expectantly, and then a silence, a pause so startling that it seemed to ripple through the ancient stone walls of the church. The bride, who had been expected to speak, did not. Her lips parted, but no words came. A murmur stirred among the guests. The vicar, gently prompting, repeated the question. Still nothing. Eleanor's face had gone curiously pale, her eyes wide and startled, like a bird caught in sudden flight. Then, before anyone could quite grasp what was happening, she turned. The bouquet tumbled from her hands, scattering white roses upon the flagstones. With a rustle of silk and tulle, she fled down the aisle, past the astonished congregation, and out through the great oak doors of the church. There was a stunned moment of silence, broken only by the creak of pews as people craned to see. Mrs. Bantry gasped aloud. Colonel Hargreaves surged to his feet, crimson with fury. Charles Denham took a half-step after her, then halted as though turned to stone. Miss Marple, serene amid the confusion, merely folded her hands and inclined her head, for she knew, with that instinct born of years of close observation, that this was not the mere folly of a nervous bride. There had been in Eleanor's eyes, in that last moment, not the tremor of doubt, but the terror of something deeper, darker. The congregation spilled out into the sunshine, buzzing like agitated bees. Some declared it was cold feet, others that it was a lover's quarrel. A few, more dramatically, whispered of madness. Colonel Hargreaves barked orders to search the grounds, his military instincts rising. Charles Denham remained curiously passive, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed upon the middle distance. By evening, when Eleanor had not returned, the matter took a graver turn. Her bridal carriage had remained untouched, her travelling case unopened. None of the village lanes or meadows revealed any trace of her. It was as though she had melted into the summer air, leaving only the faint perfume of orange blossom behind. The police were summoned from the nearby market town, and discreet inquiries were begun. But gossip moved faster than officialdom, and by the next day the entire countryside buzzed with speculation. Some said she had eloped with a former beau, others that she had been abducted. Mrs. Price Ridley, with a relish for the dramatic, declared that she had been spirited away by gypsies. Miss Marple, however, sat by her parlour window in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes far away. She recalled the look in Eleanor's eyes, that sudden, dreadful fear, not the fear of marriage, nor even of an unsuitable match. No, it had been the fear of something or someone else entirely. She pursed her lips, adjusted a dropped stitch, and thought quietly to herself that, as always, human nature was very much the same in Much Farrington as it was in St. Mary Mead. One had only to look closely, to listen carefully, and to remember. And so, when Colonel Hargreaves' pride stiffened but anxiety clear beneath called upon her, the following afternoon to seek her counsel, Miss Marple was already prepared to turn her gentle yet piercing eye upon the mystery of the vanishing bride, for, as she knew well, there was no such thing as a disappearance without reason. Somewhere among the smiling faces at St. Mary's Church, among the rustle of satin and the scent of roses, lay the truth, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and unfailing knowledge of the frailties of the human heart, meant to uncover it. Colonel Hargreaves had never before been obliged to consult a spinster of St. Mary Mead in matters of family urgency. His life had been ruled by regimental order, by commands given and received, by clear lines of duty. Yet now, with his daughter vanished in a manner so dramatic and so inexplicable, he found himself uncharacteristically adrift. Police inquiries were proceeding, but with little progress. Search parties had tramped the lanes, combed the hedgerows, and questioned villagers, all to no avail. The bride had disappeared as though the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. And so it was that Colonel Hargreaves, his moustache bristling, his step heavy, appeared one afternoon in the rose-scented parlour of Miss Jane Marple. He had, at first, made his request in the tone of a command. Miss Marple, with her customary gentleness, had simply inclined her head and murmured that she would do her best. Within an hour, she was installed at Hargreaves' house, her knitting bag discreetly at hand, her eyes observing everything and missing nothing. The household, she quickly discerned, was a hive of unrest. Mrs. Hargreaves maintained a brittle facade of composure, her lips tight, her words sharper than usual. She spoke of her daughter's foolish impulsiveness, though her hands trembled ever so slightly when she lifted her teacup. Charles Denham, the jilted bridegroom, had taken up residence at the house. A curious decision in Miss Marple's mind, for a rejected suitor might more naturally have withdrawn. He was courteous, composed, but his silences were eloquent. She noted the stiffness of his jaw, the way his eyes slid away from questions, as though guarding thoughts best left unspoken. Then there was the young man Miss Marple had noticed in the church, seated at the back with that air of disaffection. He was introduced, somewhat grudgingly, as Mr. Geoffrey Anselm, a local artist of modest repute and doubtful stability. The Colonel plainly disapproved of him, and indeed, Miss Marple quickly gathered that Geoffrey had once enjoyed a close, if somewhat tempestuous, friendship with Eleanor. His presence at the wedding had been a point of contention. The servants, too, whispered in corners. Sarah, Eleanor's maid, confided to the cook that her mistress had seemed troubled in the days before the wedding, sitting by her window for long hours, her letters scattered before her. A torn scrap of paper, later retrieved from Eleanor's dressing table, bore only the words, "I cannot. He will not let me." Miss Marple tucked that detail away with a gentle nod. The police, led by Inspector Craddock from the county town, were inclined to view the matter as either a voluntary flight or a lover's escapade gone awry. Yet, as Miss Marple quietly observed, no preparations had been made for such a departure. Eleanor's wardrobe, her jewels, her small savings all remained untouched. A runaway, Miss Marple thought, usually ran with something in hand. In the evenings, as the household gathered in the drawing-room, she allowed her needles to click softly while her ears took in every note of tension. Charles Denham was attentive to Mrs. Hargreaves, almost too attentive, as though striving to bind himself more tightly to the family. Geoffrey Anselm, with his restless energy, came and went, muttering of art and inspiration, yet his eyes held a kind of desperation. Colonel Hargreaves barked at everyone equally, but beneath his bluster lay genuine distress, and Mrs. Hargreaves, icy and proud, seemed less concerned for her daughter's safety than for the scandal that hovered over the family name. On the third morning, Miss Marple ventured into the village of Much Farrington. She found the gossip mill turning at full speed. At the post office, Mrs. Finch confided that Eleanor had been seen in earnest conversation with a stranger a fortnight before the wedding. Before the wedding, a gentleman from London, dark-haired, well-dressed, who had stayed briefly at the King's Arms. At the greengrocer's, another rumour suggested that Eleanor had quarrelled with her mother on the very eve of the ceremony. And at the vicarage, the Reverend Miles admitted with some embarrassment that Eleanor had sought him out for counsel, but had left abruptly without confiding her troubles. Everywhere Miss Marple went, she gathered threads of the tapestry, each one seemingly disconnected, yet together hinting at a darker weave. That evening, she walked quietly in the gardens of Hargreaves' house, her eyes resting on the bridal roses, now fading in the summer heat. It was there she encountered Sarah, the maid, weeping softly. The girl, startled by Miss Marple's presence, admitted that Eleanor had confided a fear not of the marriage, but of a past that would not let her go. She would say no more, frightened, it seemed, of some unspoken threat. Miss Marple returned to her little guest chamber and considered. A bride who vanishes at the altar, a suitor who stays too close, an old admirer brooding in the background, a proud mother guarding secrets, a stranger from London whose presence lingers in whispers, and a fragment of a note, "He will not let me." The picture was forming, though blurred around the edges. She could not yet say what the truth was, but she felt it lay not in the easy explanations offered by the police or the gossiping villagers. Eleanor Hargreaves had not vanished through caprice or girlish panic. She had vanished because she was compelled to, and as Miss Marple's needles clicked on, she thought of the small ways in which human beings betray themselves, the inflection of a voice, the fleeting glance, the nervous gesture. She would find the key, she knew, not in grand revelations but in these small human details. The investigation had begun, and already Miss Marple sensed that, behind the polished facade of Hargreaves' house lay a knot of secrets waiting to be untangled. The days following Eleanor's disappearance settled into a peculiar rhythm at Hargreaves' house. Each morning the Colonel blustered about police inefficiency. Each afternoon Mrs. Hargreaves maintained a frosty vigil in the drawing-room, and each evening Charles Denham took long solitary walks in the garden, returning pale and preoccupied. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken suspicions, and Miss Marple, moving gently among them like a shadow, collected her impressions as neatly as a housewife collects fallen pins. Inspector Craddock had begun to lose patience. He pressed Geoffrey Anselm with questions, pointing out that his past attachment to Eleanor might provide motive enough to spirit her away. Geoffrey, wild-eyed, insisted upon his innocence. "She was everything to me," he said more than once, his voice breaking, "but she wanted the life her parents chose for her, not the life I could offer." The police searched his modest studio, finding only canvases and discarded brushes. Though the discovery of a half-finished portrait of Eleanor, her expression one of wistful melancholy, stirred uneasy comment. Miss Marple, when asked her opinion, merely murmured that artists often saw in their subjects what others did not. The next red herring came by way of London. Inspector Craddock received a wire suggesting that Eleanor had been sighted in Kensington, entering a boarding-house under the name E. Harris. Excited at last by a tangible lead, he hurried to the capital, only to return grim-faced the following evening. The young woman was not Eleanor at all, but a milliner's apprentice fleeing from an unhappy position. The Colonel denounced the wild goose chase as proof of police incompetence. Miss Marple, however, thought it interesting that the impostor had chosen a name so close to Hargreaves. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps a deliberate misdirection. Meanwhile, the note fragment continued to trouble her. "I cannot, he will not let me." Who was this he? At first glance, it seemed to point towards Geoffrey Anselm, but his conduct, however erratic, bore the marks of wounded affection rather than sinister intent. Charles Denham, on the other hand, was a puzzle. He behaved with impeccable outward dignity, yet there was a rigidity to him, as if he were playing a part for the benefit of onlookers. When Miss Marple inquired, ever so gently, about the young man's family, she learned that the Denhams of Ashbrook Hall had known financial difficulties. A prosperous marriage would certainly be convenient. Then came the second incident. One evening, just as dusk was falling over the lawns, Sarah, the maid, screamed. She had gone to fetch linen from the summer-house at the far edge of the grounds, and there, Pinned beneath the cushion was Eleanor's bridal veil, stained with a dark splash that at first glance appeared to be blood. The household erupted into fresh turmoil. Colonel Hargreaves thundered, Mrs. Hargreaves fainted rather theatrically, and Charles Denham turned white as chalk. Inspector Craddock took possession of the veil, but laboratory analysis revealed that the stain was no more sinister than spilled port wine. Still, the symbolic cruelty of the act chilled everyone. Someone wished to suggest violence, to hint at a darker end for the vanished bride. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, considered the matter differently. Why port wine? Why a veil, and not some other token? It seemed to her not the act of a calculating criminal, but of one who wished to frighten or to distract. She thought of children who throw stones into a pond to send ripples across the surface, obscuring what lies beneath. A further ripple came from an unexpected direction. In the village, an elderly gardener who tended the churchyard confided to Miss Marple that he had seen Eleanor, or someone very like her, slip into the church vestry 2 nights before the wedding. She had carried a small parcel and seemed agitated. Later, a man had joined her. He was tall, well-dressed, and not known to the gardener. When pressed, he added that the man had a curious limp in his left leg. This detail, slight though it was, struck Miss Marple as important. None of the obvious figures in the drama bore such an affliction. Who then was this stranger? Could he be the London visitor mentioned at the post office? And what role did he play in Eleanor's fate? The final twist of this act came on a rainy afternoon when Miss Marple, rummaging in the library under pretense of seeking a novel, stumbled across a small, leather-bound volume pushed behind a row of military histories. It was Eleanor's diary. Most entries were trivial accounts of teas, fittings, and dances, but interspersed among them were darker notes. One read, "Mother insists Charles is ideal, but I feel watched, as though every step is observed. There are things I dare not tell her." Another, written scarcely a week before the wedding, "Geoffrey is impossible, yet kinder than he knows, but he is not the danger. The danger comes from elsewhere. If I speak, it will all come crashing down." Miss Marple closed the book with care, her expression grave. She had encountered many secrets in her long life, and she recognized the tone of a young woman cornered by forces beyond her strength. Eleanor had not vanished of her own free will, nor, Miss Marple thought, was it likely that she had been killed outright. No, there was design here, a pattern yet obscured. The veil, the diary, the stranger with the limphole, pointed in conflicting directions. Each clue seemed to accuse a different suspect: Geoffrey with his passion, Charles with his restraint, Mrs. Hargreaves with her cold ambition. Yet none fitted neatly, and Miss Marple, who trusted patterns as she trusted the steady rhythm of her knitting needles, knew that the truth would lie where least expected. She sat that evening in the drawing-room, the storm rattling at the windows, her needles flashing in the lamplight. Around her the household simmered with suspicion. Geoffrey brooded by the fire, Charles paced the carpet, Mrs. Hargreaves stared into the middle distance, and the Colonel muttered of honour and disgrace. And in the midst of them all, Miss Marple smiled her faint, inscrutable smile, for she had remembered something, a tale from long ago, of a neighbour's niece, a runaway engagement, and a secret marriage concealed until the proper time. Human nature, she reflected, never truly changed, and somewhere, behind the veil of confusion, the vanished bride was waiting to be found. It was on the 5th evening after Eleanor's disappearance that the threads Miss Marple had been quietly gathering began, at last, to knit together. The storm that had swept across much Farrington left behind a hush in the air, the village lanes glistening with rain. The roses in the Hargreaves' garden bowed with heavy drops. Miss Marple sat with her knitting in the morning-room, but her thoughts were not on her pattern. Instead, she reviewed each clue as she might review the squares of a patchwork quilt, testing their fit, their pattern, their hidden design. The diary, Eleanor, afraid, but not of Geoffrey; the veil, a distraction; wine masquerading as blood; the stranger with a limp, a figure from outside the family circle; the note fragment, "I cannot, he will not let me." So much, and yet it did not align. And then she recalled something seemingly trivial. Mrs. Hargreaves, during a tense conversation, had referred to Charles Denham, not as Charles, but as "our last chance," a curious phrase, especially for a proud woman who measured everything in terms of family status and position. That afternoon Miss Marple asked, in her mildest tones, to see the family solicitor. A polite but persistent inquiry revealed what she had begun to suspect. Colonel Hargreaves's finances, though concealed behind military bluster, were in a parlous state. Debts had mounted, investments gone awry. The marriage of Eleanor to Charles Denham, scion of a landed family and a rising barrister, was not merely desirable, it was necessary. But Charles himself, Miss Marple had been thinking carefully about him, his restraint, his curious refusal to show either outrage or grief, his decision to remain in the Hargreaves household when he might more naturally have retreated to London. All this suggested a man with something to conceal. And then, memory returned to her. The gardener's description of the stranger with a limp. She remembered now that she had seen Charles, once, crossing the gravel path at dusk. A slight stiffness in his left step, almost imperceptible. Most would overlook it, but Miss Marple's eyes, sharpened by years of close observation, had caught the telltale hitch. The stranger was no stranger at all. It was Charles Denham himself. That evening, while the Colonel fulminated and Mrs. Hargreaves sat rigid, Miss Marple drew Charles aside with the air of an old lady seeking company. They walked slowly in the garden, the dusk filled with the scent of damp roses. "I was thinking, Mr. Denham," she began softly, "of how very difficult it is to maintain appearances. One can keep up a brave front, but the little betrayals, an uneven step, an unfinished word are hard to disguise." Charles started slightly, then forced a smile. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple, you see," she continued gently. The gardener was quite certain of the limp. "It puzzled me at first, but then I remembered. You limp, do you not, when you are tired?" His jaw tightened. "A slight old injury, hardly worth remarking." "Ah, but people do remark, Mr. Denham," Eleanor remarked. "I think she met you in the church vestry before the wedding. That explains." The gardener's tale. "She was frightened, not of marriage itself, but of something you revealed to her, something she dared not share with her parents." For a moment his composure wavered. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "She vanished, not because she wished to, but because she was compelled by knowledge. And you, Mr. Denham, remained at the house not from devotion, but because you must control the story. If Eleanor is found, she can tell the truth. If she is not well, you remain the injured party, and sympathy lies with you." His face paled. "This is absurd. You accuse me without proof." "Oh, but there is proof," said Miss Marple, with quiet certainty. "The diary, the veil, the note. Each points, if one looks closely, to coercion rather than choice. You wished for her fortune to steady your own. But Eleanor, discovering something, perhaps your debts, or another entanglement, hesitated. You could not afford hesitation. So you arranged her disappearance." Charles's silence was telling. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner, did not press further. She merely said, "You see, Mr. Denham, truth is like knitting. One may drop a stitch, but sooner or later the pattern reveals itself, and I have no doubt Eleanor is quite safe, though hidden. She must be found, and she will be, before long." That night, in the privacy of her little guest room, Miss Marple reviewed all. She was certain now that Eleanor lived, concealed perhaps nearby, coerced into silence. The veil had been a false trail, designed to convince the household of something worse. The diary and note, though, revealed the true story. A girl desperate to escape a union that would destroy her. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. There, she asked Reverend Miles a simple question. Had Eleanor sought sanctuary in the church? The vicar, troubled, admitted that she had indeed asked about the vestry keys some weeks earlier. He had thought little of it at the time, but when Miss Marple requested a search, they discovered, hidden behind an old screen in a disused side chapel, a small parcel, Eleanor's travelling cloak, food hastily wrapped, and a letter addressed to her parents. The letter, unfinished, bore the words, "Forgive me, I must disappear. If I stay, he will destroy me. Do not believe." The ink trailed off abruptly. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Here was confirmation. Eleanor had tried to leave a warning, but someone had interrupted her, and only one man had both motive and opportunity. Charles Denham. By the time she returned to Hargreaves' house, her mind was resolved. The truth, long shadowed, was ready to step into the light. She would summon them all, the Colonel, Mrs. Hargreaves, Charles, Geoffrey, Inspector Craddock, in their presence, with all the calm authority of her years. She would reveal the fate of the vanished bride, It was late afternoon when Miss Marple, with the quiet firmness that no one ever thought to resist, asked that all the household, together with Inspector Craddock, assemble in the drawing-room of Hargreaves' house. The heavy curtains were half drawn against the waning light. The scent of roses drifted faintly through the open windows, and the atmosphere trembled with expectation. Colonel Hargreaves stood stiffly by the mantelpiece, moustache bristling, his hand clenched upon the silver snuff-box he used as a prop in moments of tension. Mrs. Hargreaves reclined in a chair, her face pale but determined, as though bracing herself for scandal. Geoffrey Anselm hovered near the window, his hands restless, his eyes burning with intensity. Charles Denham sat with perfect composure, though a faint muscle ticked in his cheek. Inspector Craddock, arms folded, glanced doubtfully at Miss Marple, as if uncertain what role an elderly spinster could truly play in so serious a matter. Miss Marple, neat in her dove-grey cardigan, her knitting bag beside her, looked at them, all with kind, wise eyes. "My dear friends," she began softly, "we have all been distressed by the tragic disappearance of Miss Eleanor Hargreaves. For days there has been speculation, rumors of cold feet, of abduction, even of worse. But I believe the truth is rather different, and it is time we faced it plainly." There was a rustle of unease. Colonel Hargreaves barked. "If you know anything, Miss Marple, kindly say so without further preamble." She inclined her head gently. "Very well, Colonel. Eleanor did not vanish of her own free will, nor did she come to harm at the hands of strangers. The person responsible for her disappearance is among us in this very room." All eyes turned, some in fear, others in shock. "She was a dutiful daughter," Miss Marple continued, "but she was also perceptive. In her diary she wrote of feeling watched, of being in danger. She left behind a note, 'I cannot. He will not let me.' That note was not about her parents' pressure, nor about Mr. Anselm's ardent attachment. It referred to the man she was about to marry, Mr. Charles Denham." A collective gasp filled the room. Charles rose to his feet, his voice smooth, though strained. "This is outrageous. I have done nothing but seek Eleanor's safety. She fled, surely that alone clears me of blame." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her voice was steady. "On the contrary, Mr. Denham, you were the very reason she fled. You met her secretly in the church vestry 2 nights before the wedding. The gardener saw you. He described a man with a limp hand, though you hide it well. You favor your left leg when tired. You were no stranger, but Eleanor's own fiancé. She discovered something about your debts, perhaps, or some entanglement in London, and she resolved to call the marriage off. But you could not allow that, could you? For without her dowry and her family's connections, your situation was precarious indeed." Charles's face had gone white. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Miss Marple's voice grew gentler. "Still, you persuaded her to hide. Perhaps you promised to protect her from scandal. But then you kept her concealed, her letter unfinished, her veil planted with wine to suggest a darker fate, all to ensure that no one would look too closely at you. But Eleanor is alive. I have found proof." She held up the small parcel discovered in the church, the cloak, the food, the unfinished letter. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, eyes widening. "Alive!" cried Mrs. Hargreaves, her composure cracking. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Eleanor has been concealed in the old gardener's cottage at the far end of the estate. A safe enough hiding place, provided no one thought to look. But Eleanor herself left clues: her diary, her veil misused, her frightened note that together formed a pattern." There was a sudden commotion at the doorway. 2 constables entered, and between them, pale but unharmed, stood Eleanor Hargreaves herself. She wore a simple cloak, her face drawn but resolute. At the sight of her daughter, Mrs. Hargreaves gave a cry, half sob, half relief, and rushed forward. Eleanor's voice, though trembling, carried clearly. "It is true. Charles discovered that I intended to break off the engagement. He said he would be ruined, that he could not let me destroy him. He begged me to hide for a few days, until he could arrange matters. I was frightened. I believed him, but when I tried to leave a letter, he stopped me." Charles Denham sagged into his chair, his facade of composure crumbling. Inspector Craddock snapped the handcuffs shut with brisk efficiency. The colonel, red-faced, muttered of disgrace, of betrayal, of the ruin of honor. But Miss Marple, with a look both firm and kind, placed a hand upon his arm. "Better a little disgrace, Colonel, than the loss of a daughter. Eleanor has been spared a most unhappy marriage. That, at least, is something to be thankful for. The room, heavy with tension, began to breathe again. Geoffrey Anselm looked at Eleanor with eyes full of longing, though he said nothing. Mrs. Hargreaves, for once softened, clasped her daughter's hands and murmured words of forgiveness. Inspector Craddock, suitably chastened, admitted that Miss Marple's insight had outstripped official methods once more. Later, as dusk settled and calm returned, Miss Marple sat quietly in the garden, her knitting needles flashing in the fading light. The roses were battered from the storm but still fragrant, their petals opening bravely once more. Mrs. Bantry, who had hurried over at the first whisper of Eleanor's return, sat beside her. "Jane," she said, "how on earth did you see what—" "None of us could." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes far away. "My dear Dolly, it was simply a matter of noticing the little things. People imagine crime is built of grand gestures, but in truth it is made of trifles: a limp, a misplaced veil, a frightened look in a young girl's eyes. Human nature does not change, and if one remembers that, one sees quite a lot." She folded her knitting, satisfied. Order for now was restored. The bride had returned, the villain unmasked, and the village would resume its tranquil course until, of course, the next little ripple disturbed the calm dot, for in the quiet English countryside, Miss Marple knew there was always another mystery waiting just beyond the roses.